So yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you today about conversational surveys. And you've probably seen there's been a lot of talk about qual at scale. And I think, in my opinion, this framing kind of does a bit of a disservice both to qualitative research, it's definitely augmented by conversational AI, I wouldn't say it's necessarily fundamentally transformed. But I think it also does a disservice to the potential strengths of quantitative research when transformed with conversational AI. And so for me, it's more accurate to look at qualitative research as a spectrum and to differentiate between what we might call deep qual, which involves, a focus on maybe what's left unsaid, and requires nuanced and often even embodied human understanding, versus something more like light qual, which is maybe incorporating elements and principles of qualitative research into quantitative research, but still focusing on what people are directly saying. Our current technology is perfectly capable of doing this. So the appeal of conversational surveys is not that we're replacing qual, not by any means. The magic is that we get to take a research methodology, which is frankly kind of dying, and to transform it into an effective methodology which captures meaningful insights with statistical strength, while also moving in the direction of deeper nuance. So even though I work on AI for a living, I think people are pretty tired of hearing about AI recently, and I don't want to focus on that. So I'd really rather today focus on the methodological innovations and sort of the extended toolbox that conversational surveys give us. So before I talk about conversational surveys, I'm not going to go into depth about the limitations of traditional surveys. You're probably already familiar with that. But I do, sort of by way of introduction, do want to mention I was involved in my first survey design back in university around something like 10 years ago. And I was working in a lab studying consciousness and ideas such as the extended and the embodied mind, where cognition is made not by brains, but by brains living in complex bodies enmeshed in complex worlds. And so one of our studies involved mystical experiences and the impact that they have on people's lives. And you can probably imagine how disappointing it was to ask people to describe these life-changing experiences by selecting options from a list. They didn't even have the opportunity to truly explain themselves and to be heard. And I mean, even asking open-ended questions in a survey is not really allowing the participant to be fully heard, not from their experience at least. And because, it's not happening in real time like a conversation does. We're deeply social creatures, and we became habituated to surveys long ago. But conversations are different, and conversational surveys, in my opinion, fill a beautiful middle ground where participants can feel heard and be engaged, but not necessarily feeling certain pressures or personal rigidity that they might feel when talking with a human stranger. So just to give you a little glimpse of one part of conversational surveys, which is probing or just sort of dynamically generated follow-up questions, I just want to show you this to illustrate a few different possibilities that probing unlocks. So one of them is empathetic engagement, just building a rapport with participants. Another is elaboration, getting additional relevant details. And then there's also elucidation, clarifying incomplete or even ambiguous responses. But there's a lot more to conversational surveys than just eliciting additional open-ended verbatims. And I think there's very specific methodological innovations that we should really think about and apply seriously. So one is the fact that conversational surveys can increase disclosure and validity through engagement. There's clear evidence to show that engaged, or rather disengaged participants are not necessarily giving what we would consider valid answers, and they're not necessarily disclosing things that we would want them to disclose. Another is that we can't really understand rationales and nuance in traditional surveys, but that's something that conversational surveys really excel at. And this goes beyond what can be achieved just with generic follow-ups or open-ended questions. And this demonstrably leads to actionable insights through analysis at scale. Another is the semi-structured flow of that conversational surveys give us that actually allows for opportunities for participant dynamics. And I'll talk about this more in a moment. Another is about capturing emotion and structured information. Despite, certain popular claims that LLMs don't really get empathy, that's not really borne out by the evidence. They actually show significant alignment with cross-cultural human emotions, at least when used appropriately. And they can be very, very useful for understanding and analyzing emotions expressed by people. In the case of market research as well, they can be used for eliciting very specific structured information that's pertinent to your research objectives. And then another consideration is that they can be very effective when protecting against fraud. So conversational interfaces themselves, whether the participant is typing into an interface or speaking, that's a very strong informational signal that can help us in detecting humans versus machines. I can guarantee you, if you give me a totally closed-ended survey, I can have an AI go through that and you won't be able to tell whether it was me or the AI. So another thing I want to mention is about the sort of real-time opportunities that you get with conversational surveys to really dynamically direct the conversational flow. So I think it's useful to think of conversational surveys as almost semi-structured interviews, where you still get the structure of a typical quantitative survey, but you also get rich information that you can elicit and analyze in real time, and so that you can even orient the entire conversation around particular targets of interest. You can also do things like adaptive probing. So for example, based on whether users are giving high quality responses, looking at different dimensions such as effort, consistency, relevance, you can decide if you want to probe further or probe less or even terminate them. Plus, projective techniques allow for elicitation of information in a very different way. And so all these things combined allow for a very different approach to designing survey flow and thinking about what the participant experience will be. So practically speaking, there's also a huge methodological concern, which is, of course, the biases. And this is not necessarily something that gets talked about enough, specifically when looking at traditional surveys versus conversational surveys. So this I wanted to kind of highlight. With traditional surveys, there are at least three kind of response biases. So there's acquiescence bias, there's order effect bias, and then there's survey fatigue. And they can be related, there can be some overlap. But basically, by giving people close-ended responses, even if you are doing good practices such as randomization, you're not really solving the bias. You're only really obscuring it to some extent. Versus if you're using effective conversational survey design, all of these can be mitigated. That said, there are other biases that you start to introduce when you use conversational surveys. So specifically, social desirability bias, which is present sort of in all human-led or qualitative type interviews, as well as participants may be less likely to disclose certain details because they might have concerns about, let's say, data processing. That said, both of these can be mitigated with appropriate question wording and a disclosure about how their data will be processed. So that's it. What I wanted to end with is just this analogy that my business partner, Kathy, the CEO, often shares. And this is from an art installation at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And you're probably familiar with the adage that a single death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. And for me, what I want to relate here is that I think conversational surveys represent really a methodological breakthrough, which can give us visceral details with quantifiable significance. That is, we can get both the tragedy and the statistics. So that's my presentation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing anyone that may have, in the breakout rooms, anyone that may have experience with conversational surveys, or how hopefully this presentation can help you think about how you might be able to get past certain constraints in your traditional surveys. Thank you, everyone.